I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Julia Marshall. She is a developmental psychologist and a postdoctoral research fellow at Boston College, where she studies children's social cognitive development and the development of cooperation. Julia, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here today.
Thanks for taking the time to be here.
Of
So
course.
I'd love to talk about your background. We can go way back, like what first got you interested in psychology and specifically in studying children?
Very excellent question. I would say it's kind of a stereotypical story in some ways. I was in high school, and in high school we read Crime and Punishment, which I'm sure you may be familiar with the story. And that novel has many philosophical themes in it that are very much related to many of the topics that I study today. And I was just fascinated by that novel when I was in school. It really sort of turned me on to some more philosophical ideas that I had never encountered before, and really got me curious thinking about punishment and crime, obviously. And I sort of then expanded upon that when I went to college and took a variety of philosophy classes, but also psychology classes. And along the way, I just found myself more drawn to psychology and actually studied psychopathy and how sort of people that with more psychopathic tendencies make moral decisions, very far-fetched from children. And then when I went to grad school, I sort of switched gears and wanted to keep studying morality and psychology and philosophy, but was particularly interested in sort of switching populations and thinking about how we sort of initially think about moral concepts. And that drew me to studying children.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I also came to psychology through kind of more philosophical interests. And reading Dostoevsky in high school, that sounds pretty intense.
Yeah, I mean, it was an excellent class. I think back on it very fondly. I should definitely email that English teacher in particular, because I doubt he knows how much he impacted my research interests. But it was just really interesting to sort of, I think, for the most part in high school, I had read many other novels, plays, etc. But that one just stood out to me and really sort of drew me into sort of more philosophical ideas about punishment and morality that I hadn't encountered before.
So when you were studying psychopathy, were you planning to go the clinical route, or did you end up doing a developmental PhD?
So I was never, it's kind of, I think there's this impression that, sometimes people have this really, well articulated thought about where they're going to go and what their plans were. And that was by far not my experience at all. So I actually was really interested, because of sort of my interest in psychology, but also philosophy, was actually thinking about going to law school. So throughout much of college, I actually was like preparing to go to law school, took the LSAT and all these sorts of things. So at the time, I really had no conception of like, am I going to do a clinical PhD or a developmental one? Those things kind of ended up it just kind of ended up working out that way. It was sort of where my life ended me up with, for lack of better words. But I'm really grateful for it, because I think what was generally pushing me forward was an interest in morality and research, and less so was like a passion of working with children. But I've sort of learned now how interesting it is to work with children and the types of questions and research that we can conduct with children. And that's sort of kept me in this, and it really keeps me going now.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what does studying morality look like in an experimental research setting as opposed to kind of armchair philosophy?
Yeah, so I think I teach this class in the summers called Moralities of Everyday Life. And the first week of that class, we sort of talk first about moral philosophy, sort of the typical moral philosophies that might help us to evaluate the actions that we take. So like consequentialism, what makes something moral is what has the best outcome for people, generates the least amount of suffering, the greatest amount of happiness. Or deontology, which is more based on duties or obligations that we have to people, regardless of the consequences. And so as an armchair philosopher, you can discuss the values of those different philosophies. Which one's better? What's a better philosophy to sort of abide by? But moral psychology is different from that. Instead, we're interested as moral psychologists sort of in what ways do our intuitions, our behaviors cohere with one of those philosophies more than the other, without placing a value judgment on it. I don't have a strong feeling about, I don't spend a lot of my time thinking about whether consequentialism or deontology is better, but I do spend a lot of time thinking about in what situations children think in one way or the other. And so I think that's the sort of large distinction between sort of the psychological research on morality and the philosophical approach. And for me, I'm more interested in sort of understanding humans, understanding the types of decisions they make and the types of thoughts they have around these ideas.
Right. And by focusing on development, you can sort of ask what factors led up to these adults having these certain beliefs.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think there's sometimes a big misconception where I in general study children between the ages of, around 4 or 5 up until 8 or 9. And in many ways, I think this helps us to capture sort of the raw beliefs that children might have. I'd like to think that before society can come in and corrupt you, But at the same time, it's really important to acknowledge that 5-year-olds are very sophisticated human beings who have had a lot of exposure to a lot of ideas. So it's not the case that it's a, purely raw belief or purely raw behavior. But it is certainly less exposed to social sort of social norms and cultures than my behavior is as a 28-year-old, So in many ways, by looking at children younger and younger, we can start to chart exactly how this behavior emerges over time and how it might be really similar or really different from adult behavior. So I don't want to give the impression that studying kids at 5 years old reveals innate behavior, because it likely doesn't. But it does give us some insight into sort of the initial starting point,
Yeah, that was going to be one of my next questions. Like, how much is based on your culture and how much is like sort of universal patterns of human behavior that will just emerge cross-culturally?
Yeah, I mean, this is the foundational question that we all want to know. I think in many ways, it kind of depends on what kind of behavior you're talking about. So even across a lot of the research I do, there are some situations where we see really similar child behavior to adult behavior. And there are other cases where we see really different behavior from children and adults. And so I don't think we could broadly say, morality is really, rooted in these, early emerging beliefs and behaviors, or it's completely socially determined. I think in many ways it's a combination, and it really depends on the particular part of morality that you want to focus on or you're curious about.
Yeah, that's always the answer with this nature nurture debate. It's like it's both. So
Exactly.
what are some examples of the way of areas where children and adults have a lot of overlap and a lot of difference in their beliefs?
Yeah. So from my perspective, and this, is a sort of narrow one, I'll just give one example. So one case where it seems like there's really similar behavior, or at least roots to very similar behavior across childhood and adulthood, is a willingness to punish others. So I'm really interested in punishment, and punishment is sort of the imposition of a cost on a transgressor. So, you might be fined by a police officer for driving really fast, an experience that I unfortunately had to undergo a month ago. And that's sort of punishment, right? And when we see someone do something wrong in society, we often feel a desire that they should be held accountable for that behavior. And there's been a lot of really interesting work emerging in the past decade or so, finding that children at very young ages across a lot of different cultures are willing to punish others, even when they're unaffected. So this is a fancy term that we call third-party punishment. So for example, if someone did something really mean to me right now and you witnessed it, Adam, your willingness to punish the person who harmed me is the sort of third-party punishment. And we see that in children at very young ages, and we see that in adulthood. And so that seems to be a behavior that, at least from my perspective, has these very early roots in development. So that's kind of a case where you see similarities. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And do we know why they do it? Do children justify like why specifically they want to punish?
It's a great question. And it was actually the topic of a paper that I wrote last year with my collaborator, Daniel Yudkin, who's at University of Pennsylvania now, I believe, and my supervisor at the time, Molly Crockett. And we were really interested in kind of connecting these philosophical ideas that I encountered, in Dostoevsky with children's punishment decisions. So are children punishing for sort of just the desire to inflict deserved suffering. So this is kind of a retributive idea, or to actually teach a lesson. So to promote good future behavior. So this is more consequentialist. And we find that children, when we manipulate the situation in specific ways to sort of isolate these different factors, children punish for both reasons. So they're interested in inflicting suffering and also in promoting good behavior in the future. And that's also true of adults. So this is another case where it seems like early behaviors seem to track or, be similar to adults in many ways. And this isn't really asking their justifications. They're not really providing verbal justifications, but it's looking at their behavioral patterns, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What about when you're the wrongdoer and when they're on the receiving end of the punishment? Like, I don't know if this is right, but I would imagine that maybe adults might be more willing to take punishment when they know they've done something wrong, and children might think like, it shouldn't apply to me.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really excellent question. In experimental settings, it's hard to study how transgressors respond to punishment in many ways, because we would have to capitalize on children sort of spontaneously doing something wrong in an experimental setting. Does that kind of make sense? So we usually focus on situations where they're observing a transgression or they're the victim of it. But I actually don't know of any work where we study how children respond to punishment having done something wrong. And so I think that's a really interesting question that I'm less familiar with any work on that actually. And I can imagine that would be a really interesting thing to study if we can kind of like nudge children to do bad things and then see how they would react to having been punished. Would they think it's, for the purposes of having them suffer, or for the purposes of them, promoting good behavior in the future?
Yeah, that does sound interesting. I've heard of some studies, I don't know if it was on children or not, but it's something like, you put people in a room and maybe there's an experimenter there watching, and maybe they're playing a game or something, and it's very easy to cheat. And they won't cheat while the experimenter's there, but then if they leave, and the test is to see whether people cheat or not. And I don't remember what the findings were, but you could see that I think more often people were willing to cheat once there was no one watching.
Totally. I actually, as you asked your question, was thinking of those sorts of paradigms as a way to get at this question, because I don't know the studies off the top of my head, but I'm familiar with this particular set of findings, that children are willing to cheat or sort of engage in sort of subtly antisocial behaviors when they're not being watched or they're being incentivized. So like if they could get a really good prize by lying about something small, they will often sort of fudge the truth in those contexts to get the better outcome. So it would be really interesting if researchers could leverage those particular paradigms to look into how children react to having been punished when they do something wrong. I'm sure they would be very embarrassed based off of my experience with children. I'm sure they would feel very ashamed for having lied or for having done something wrong. I would imagine they would be very quick to either defend their behavior or sort of justify it or apologize, any sort of those responses.
Yeah, the justifying would be interesting, because I imagine with an adult, it would sort of be harder, because it would be harder to justify your wrongdoing.
100%.
Yeah. So what is it actually like working with children? Like in terms of I don't know if you've done any work with adults, but how is it different from traditional experiments?
It's so different, actually. So part of the reason I actually love working with children is, I think it's super interesting the types of questions we can ask children and the types of, interpretations and revelations that we can garner from working with developmental samples. But what I really love is just working with families. It's really a treasure of my job, in fact. And it's really cool to see how children behave in real time. So developmental studies often are much more in person, just in general, than adult studies. Many adult studies nowadays are done online through sort of survey methods where, you'll answer questions through a survey platform. And that is just the whole experimental setup. And, that is been very nice for adult psychology researchers during COVID, because you can continue doing much of that during the pandemic. A lot of developmental work often involves bringing families into the lab, working with them, explaining the context of the study, and sort of devising developmental child-friendly approaches that are understandable to young children. And you get to work with them and see how they sort of respond and react in real time to a lot of these questions, which is just so fascinating, sort of seeing your data sort of emerge live is just very exciting. Now, because of the pandemic, we've actually transitioned to doing a lot of our studies on Zoom. So we'll do sort of interviews on Zoom, much like we're doing right now, and ask them questions and probe their responses sort of through an interview type of technique online.
That makes sense. So you're actually, it's not just like data that you collect and analyze behind a screen. You're actually interacting with the kids often.
Yeah, across so many different situations. So we'll do it in lab where families will volunteer their time to come in. We'll also go to parks. So during grad school, I spent a lot of time in Central Park exchanging Play-Doh for 5 minutes of their child's time. We'll also spend time in museums and other sorts of public spaces where we can recruit families to, participate in our studies in exchange for, a small token or a small gift that we can give them.
Do there tend to be differences in the types of people who are willing to participate in research as opposed to like, your average family?
This is a great question that many people, I think, are trying to better understand. I think it's certainly the case that the families that are willing to participate in research, especially, take time out of their day to bring their kid into the lab, are a specific demographic. And a lot of labs are trying to do a better job now of tracking that information to better characterize their samples. What's actually super cool about the Zoom setup, which has been created because of the pandemic, so I guess it's a silver lining, if you can say that, is that we're able to recruit families from a lot more diverse places. So, I went to grad school in New Haven, Connecticut. The majority of my participants were from New Haven, Connecticut. Now, we can recruit people from all over the country and have people from all different locations, all different walks of life participate in these studies. And so in many ways, I think we'll actually see a shift in the papers that are published in the next 10 years or so, that these papers, might represent at least a more geographically diverse set of participants than had ever been seen before in developmental psychology.
That's great. So you're studying cooperation now. How did you become interested? Like most of the research I've heard is studying what happens when those processes go wrong, like antisocial behavior. And then social behavior, it almost seems like it's sort of a given. So let's talk about what it's like studying that.
Yeah, I think when it comes to cooperative behavior, I'd like to say it's the flip side of the antisocial behavior, like you said. So it's a little bit more fun, a little bit more positive to study, but that's not why I was drawn to it, I guess. I think what's really cool is humans as a species are remarkably cooperative beings. There's it's not a story, but it's a part of a book that my old PhD advisor, Paul Bloom, would always bring up. And he didn't invent the story, it was someone else's. So I should look up whose story this actually is. But it always stuck with me, which is, us as humans, we get onto an airplane and we, follow in line, properly sit where we're supposed to sit, sometimes for extremely long periods of time. I flew from Germany last week. It was 11 hours, and that was a very cooperative process. Everyone followed the rules. No one got mad at each other. And in the news, we've heard lately about some disruptions to this cooperative process. But imagine doing that with any other animal, right? Any other animal trying to get them onto a plane to sit there for 11 hours to sort of engage in this cooperative endeavor where we're all just trying to get to a destination. That just wouldn't work. And so I love this example because you can kind of envision just, a bunch of monkeys on a plane, right? It just doesn't, it's not as cohesive. And I'll look up whose story this actually was so I can properly give them their citation. But I just really love that because I think it speaks to how us as humans are so apt to adopt norms, to follow those norms, and we enforce those norms on other people. And that's a very special part of what it means to be human.
That makes a lot of sense. So thinking about how that would work with animals, I mean, you do have some animals who are like amazingly trained and can do all sorts of things. So how much of it do you think has to do with something uniquely human versus the fact that like for the first 18 years of life, if not really throughout all our lives, we're kind of being socially conditioned in different ways?
Yeah, I mean, I'm coming at my response to this question, I think, kind of comes from a comparative psychology perspective, which I've never done work with animals myself, but I'm somewhat familiar with the approaches that people use to answer these types of questions. So, we can develop paradigms that we can use with infants and we can use with non-human primates, for example. And this can kind of start to tell us, to what extent is a behavior present in a non-human animal or non-human primate versus absent compared to a child, for example. And just as an example with respect to the punishment example I raised earlier about this concept of third-party punishment, there is some work by Katrine Riedel and colleagues that finds that non-human primates are not willing to engage in this sort of third-party punishment behavior. So that kind of speaks to maybe this is like a human unique willingness that only children are willing to exhibit around the ages of 4 or 5. So that would speak to it being human unique. But again, that's just one type of moral behavior. There are many types of moral behavior, some of which are more shared with other species, including a willingness to help strangers. So it kind of depends, again, on what behavior you're speaking to, and that kind of can begin to give us insight into the degree to which something's human unique or not. So it's not like all cooperation is human unique. There are some facets of it which are, and other facets which aren't.
Yeah. Have you seen this Franz de Waal experiment where there's 2 monkeys and they're feeding them grapes or cucumbers, and the grapes is a way better snack? And so a monkey is receiving cucumbers right next to his friend, or maybe not his friend after this event, who's receiving grapes, and he just gets so mad and he's like shaking the cage. Yeah.
Yes, I have. I went to undergrad at Emory, and Franz de Waal was the professor there. So this was like quintessential material that everyone learned about as a psychology major at Emory. So definitely very familiar, and it's very interesting. So that's an example here where they're able to do these really interesting, revealing experiments with monkeys in ways that show their parts, perhaps what we call disadvantageous inequity aversion. So when you get less than someone else, you're really upset about that. You'll protest that. That might be something that's more shared across species. Whereas there are other features of our moral psychology, maybe this concept of third-party punishment, that aren't. They're just aspects of human psychology. And that's kind of cool, right? Because then using all these methods and tools, we can start to reveal which parts of morality, whether it's punishment, whether it's prosocial behavior, fairness, inequality, how do they sort of map onto different species, and when do they emerge at different times? And it's a really interesting picture to paint. That is essentially my job. So I'm pretty lucky to do that.
Yeah, that's very cool. So like many animals might have this desire for punishment, or this sort of morality that's based on maybe this more emotional thing based on how things directly impact them. But with humans, we sort of abstract it into this higher principle and then base our judgments off of that.
Potentially. I mean, I would have to think about it a lot more, but just in line with what you're saying, in the same work on third-party punishment, they also look at second-party punishment, which is, if you were to do something mean to me, would I retaliate against you or punish you? And they do find that non-human primates engage in that type of behavior. So in that way, when when you're the victim of the circumstances, whether, you're being treated unfairly or something like that, you'll not only protest that behavior as evidenced by the Franz de Waal video you're referencing, but you'll also go to lengths or take costs to punish the person who had done something wrong to you. So in many ways, it seems like those types of behaviors seem emergent in these non-human primates or these other different species. But when it comes to other types of behaviors like third-party punishment, that might not be the case.
So with third-party punishment, I can think of maybe 2 ideas for how it emerges. There's probably many more, but one would be sort of more like a deontological thing, like you were talking about earlier, where it's just like you create these principles and then you apply them everywhere. And the other might be more related to empathy or theory of mind, where it's like, even if this is a stranger to you, since you're able to imagine what it would be like to be in that situation, you want to make it right.
Yeah, I think both of those probably are occurring. This is a big question right now, which is, and there's many different ways in which we can approach it, which is if we take it to be true, or at least the evidence currently suggests that, maybe this third party punishment behavior is, uniquely emergent in humans around the ages of 4 or 5, depending on the certain circumstances. What makes it the case that third party punishment evolves in humans? And a lot of researchers have dedicated time and effort to trying to sort this out. And there are lots of different explanations. So one explanation, like you alluded to, is that it's actually just a byproduct of empathy. So, when we see someone hurt or, experience unfairness or be treated wrongly, we feel that ourselves. And as a result, because we have the desire to engage in second party punishment when we're the victims, when we see that in other people, we're keen to then punish. And this behavior can be explained through this emotional pathway. Alternatively, though, there are other sorts of explanations as well. So it might be the case that, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but you could imagine that it's really functional in a society to have punishment mechanisms, because punishment can help adhere people or get people to follow norms. So if I think that I'll be punished for speeding, that might prevent me from driving super fast on the highway, for example. And so this idea that punishment is this really important mechanism to sustain cooperation and maintain cohesiveness within a society might make the argument that we're just sort of born, like we're naturally inclined or drawn to this idea that, those who do things wrong should be punished. And so that might also be supported through these sort of emotional mechanisms. So I think the question of, why third party punishment exists is a really, really interesting one. As it stands, I'm not totally convinced that, the developmental data can speak to that, because all we know is that kids engage in punishment. It's less clear to us exactly why that's the case. And I think more research needs to happen on that front.
And there are different patterns for different ages, right? Like you mentioned, you work with 5-year-olds, but like a 3-year-old probably wouldn't have the cognitive capacity to be able to make those types of judgments, right?
Yeah, sorry about that. My cat gets fed at this time, so that was his automatic feeder. Yes, with respect to age effects, it's a really interesting question. And I think that in many ways, it's kind of multifaceted. So it depends on the context. There's a lot of work, for example, much of this work is focused around fairness. So if I am given 10 resources and I only give you one out of those 10 resources, that's an unfair distribution. And as an observer to that, you could then punish me for that unfairness, right? And the majority of work on this is kind of been the work that's been deployed cross-culturally. So within these contexts, I think it's where we know the most. And we know that this behavior, a propensity to punish in these unfairness situations, grows stronger as you get older and emerges at slightly different developmental times, depending on the culture that you're living in. So in that way, there is a lot of sort of cultural and social input that will shape the expression of this behavior. And when it comes to other things, though, we see that the willingness to punish when someone does something wrong, like ripping up someone's artwork, is really early emerging. So, well, I guess I shouldn't say really, because it's not babies, but like is substantially earlier than fairness. So fairness, you see an earliest willingness to punish unfairness around 6. But there's evidence showing that even 3-year-olds are willing to punish someone who rips up someone else's artwork. And why that's the case is not especially clear to me, but it's a question I think a lot of people want to pursue.
Yeah, I guess it's also harder the younger you go, how to sort of translate whatever they're doing into actual words and thoughts, because like you could imagine having a baby and it has a bottle and you take it away and they start screaming. So like maybe on the inside, they're thinking like, how dare you? And maybe they're flailing their arms and wishing that would mean punishment, like if they could hit you, but you can't really tell.
Exactly. I mean, that's the big challenge as someone who studies this and does this for a living. I think we really need to come up with more creative ways to investigate these behaviors at even younger ages, because, you know, a lot of the tasks that I do, even though we try to make them as child friendly as possible, there's no way a child like much younger than 3 would be able to engage in them. And so that's something that I'm really curious about. There was a really recent paper that I know the last name of the first author was Zeev, I believe. I don't know their first name. And it was out of Jessica Somerville's lab, where they did this really interesting task with young children. It was younger than 5 for sure. And they could press buttons where someone who was unfair would either be like admonished or punished in some way, or would be rewarded in another way. And so this is like easier for younger children to engage in, because it's kind of like an iPad game, right?
Yeah.
And there they actually find, similar to what I was saying about the fairness stuff before, because this is in the context of a fairness violation, you don't see these younger children sort of preferentially engaging in the mean thing, which would be punishment, or the nice thing, which is reward, in response to these selfish distributors. But those sorts of methods, I think, are really promising and interesting, because they're a little bit like more flexible, and I think younger children can deal with them more. They don't require as much sort of verbal explanation.
So it seems like whenever you're evaluating unfairness, you sort of have this implicit expectation for what would be fair, and then you're looking at how much it deviates from whatever that expectation is.
Totally. And I think in part, this might be what explains why the willingness to punish unfairness might emerge later. So you kind of have to learn the norms of the society about what is fair, how do I respond to this, these sorts of things. And this might require a lot of cognitive coordination and behavioral motivation that may or may not be sort of naturally emerging necessarily within the context of fairness in particular. So I think that's a really curious question, which is like, how are children coordinating this knowledge? How are they learning this knowledge, this type of thing, is within the specific domain of fairness.
What about the flip side, where you have an expectation that's met or exceeded, and you want to reward someone?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think when people are fair, they're keen to be nice to them, to be kind to them. So it reminds me of a lot of the research on prosocial behavior. So just, you know, when people help other people, or when they're kind to other people, we also evaluate them positively. So, you know, we have an expectation that people ought to act fairly. And if they do, we think that's a really good and a nice thing. And there's evidence to suggest that infants will reward those actors for acting fairly and meeting expectations. And sort of outside of the context of fairness, this is also true. You know, if someone helps their friend, if they drop their books in the hallway, it's a really good and a nice thing that that friend did that. And so it seems like children not only, you know, express a willingness to punish unfairness and other antisocial behaviors, but if someone acts in accordance to norms, they also think that's a really good thing and are inclined to act positively toward those individuals.
So here's another very philosophical question. It's the idea that everything is selfish. I guess there's no such thing as truly altruistic behavior. So do you think in children, or just in people more generally, there's a genuine motivation to do good? Or is it more like, if I behave in this good way, then people are going to reward me and people are going to like me and I'm going to benefit, so I'm going to do that?
Yeah, I think this is a common question that people confront. And my typical first response to this sort of thing is, there are different levels of analysis that we can investigate this question or sort of confront it. So on one level, any behavior that we do at an ultimate level, so an evolutionary sense, is selected for because it confers some sort of fitness benefit. This is a principle of evolutionary psychology. So when we're talking about, you know, why third-party punishment evolves or why prosocial behavior emerges, it has to be because it provides some sort of fitness benefit to a group or to an individual, for example. Now, this doesn't mean that at the proximate level, so me as an individual, whenever I engage in third-party punishment or in prosocial behavior, that I'm doing it for the express purpose of, you know, benefiting my fitness. So think of this example. There's a mother who wants to feed her child. Now, the mother might be doing it because, it's important to raise her child so that her child can give back to her in the future at some point, right? But I don't think that's actually what's occurring. I think the mom's doing it because she loves her child. Now, where does that love come from? Is that evolutionarily selected for so that, parents care for their offspring? Probably, most likely. But the proximate experience of engaging in that behavior is not one that's tied to the explicit benefits that might be conferred in the future. And so in many cases, I think I focus more, like what I study is more focused on the proximate manifestations of these behaviors in children. So why are children engaging in prosocial behavior? Why are they engaging in punishment? And there is some evidence to suggest that many of these behaviors are modulated by self-interested concerns. So for example, there's a lot of really interesting work on reputation. So will children do something more? Will they be, more prosocial or more kind if they know other people are going to find out, compared to when they're doing it in private? And it seems like in many cases, particularly in prosocial behavior, that is the case. Now, does that mean, though, that the initial interest in being prosocial is strictly self-interested? I'm not sure I think that's true. I don't think the youngest children, who are helping a stranger in Felix Warnekin's famous studies, those are other great videos to see if you haven't, sort of akin to the Franz de Waal videos of toddlers sort of going to help someone open a cabinet who they ever met. I don't think, at least my impression is not that these, toddlers are engaging in this because they expect, the experimenter to reward them. It seems like a more spontaneous desire. And they've done a lot of studies on these, a little bit outside of my scope of understanding. I would have to do a little bit of research, but my impression of that work, at least, is that, providing incentives, self-interested incentives to promote prosocial behavior, they work a little bit, but children are perfectly willing to do these types of behaviors in the absence of those incentives. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, the younger you are, the less likely you're going to be to overthink, like, how's this going to benefit me in the long term?
Exactly. And from my senses, these reputational concerns sort of come online around 5 or 6 years of age. So children are thinking more deeply about what other people think about them around those ages, and they'll calibrate their behavior in interesting ways to cohere with, behavior that should promote their reputation. But I think there's a really interesting role for that research. I think it's fascinating, but I also don't think that means that the behavior is fundamentally self-interested. I think there's just self-interested concerns that intersect with the desire to engage in a behavior. And if I can just give one more example of this, is in one of the studies that we did, we were looking at children's willingness to engage in third-party punishment behavior. And we told the kids, like, look, we're going to switch experimenters after you make the decision. So it's not even like the person explaining the study will know your decision. You're never going to meet this kid who you're going to punish or could potentially punish, or the victim, and they'll never learn a lesson from your punishment behavior. And yet children are still willing to take personal cost to punish. So it seems like it's more born out of this intrinsic deontological desire to punish than it is a concern about, what does this experimenter think about my behavior? Or, what if this person knows something about me as a function of what I've done? They're kind of doing it in this purest form, which I think is really fascinating.
What about when the external pressures are going in the opposite direction of your sort of internal desires or internal moral compass? Like, for example, whether it's an experimenter or maybe like people who are popular and that you're trying to get to like you, telling you to do something that you feel like would be wrong.
Yeah, that just reminds me of a lot of like conformity research in social psychology and research on conformity and also just norm following in general. And we know that, teenagers fall prey to peer pressure. And this is something we want to intervene on as adults, and teach teenagers that they can say no to things and don't have to follow the norms and that kind of thing. It's that topic's less of a feature of my particular research program, but I do think it's a really interesting question. Just right off the top of my head, like, we know that children at young ages, learn norms, they soak that information in a lot and behave in ways that cohere with those norms. So my impression is if the norm were something bad and, people were punished for doing something good from our perspective, then children would be more inclined to engage in the bad behavior because they're learning the norm, which is like, you're supposed to do this like bad thing. But that would be really interesting to see. I think there's actually some adult work showing that, like, if the norm is to steal, right, then, and people are punished for not stealing or something of the sort, then you definitely see an uptick in stealing behavior because that's what the norm is, and people are being punished for not following the norm, even if it's an antisocial norm.
Right. And then maybe you could imagine a small number of people would be like, let's revolt against this bad system. It reminds me of Kohlberg's stage theory, and it's something like most people reach a certain stage where it's like maybe whatever they think is good and bad is just whatever society expects, but a small minority of them create like these principles that they're willing to follow, even if it goes against what everyone else is saying.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I think the questions you're asking get at this really deeper question, which is like, if we have like a set of principles that we'll follow, it's not like, are we completely blank slates and like we just soak in the norm and recognize who's being punished for what behavior and then behave in accordance to that? Or do we kind of have an anchor? So we're more keen to follow the fairness norms if it's a 5-5 distribution than if it's something different. So we're sort of more, pre-prepared to cohere to that particular norm than to another one. Even though it might be the case that we could cohere to a different norm, we have sort of what we call priors about what we're willing to engage in or what sorts of norms we're willing to buy into from a very young age. And you see that in many ways that I think, children might be really willing to buy into these norms about, you don't ruin someone's artwork, like you don't rip up their work, right? And so they like super recognize that, and they think that's really bad, and that then drives their punishment behavior from a very young age. Whereas they might need a bit more social input when it comes to these fairness things to learn what's the right way to act and what's the right way to respond and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that seems to tie back, at least assuming that we have these sort of anchors to what you were saying about evolutionary psychology.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a lot of people that would probably vehemently disagree with what I'm saying and would argue that a lot more of this behavior is a function of social learning or social information that children are receiving. And it's not so much anchored in these like prior beliefs that we have. I just come from the perspective that based off of what I've learned, that it does seem like there are certain behaviors that children are pretty keen or inclined to engage in from a very young age. But of course, that research is always qualified by, children, even if you're testing them at 3, like I said from the very beginning, have a ton of exposure to the world and to people. And so it's a really just fundamentally hard research question to ever totally know the answer to for sure.
A while ago, I was speaking with Richard Tremblay. He's a developmental psychologist who studies aggression, and some of his research found that there were sort of these innate temperamental factors. So like some children are more aggressive than others, and it might be like hereditary. So how does that bias your either your values or your prosocial behavior?
Yeah, that's fascinating. This also somewhat relates to an earlier conversation we were having about the natures of the samples that we collect. So, prior to COVID, much of the samples that we were collecting were, limited to a specific geographical area, and it was really hard to collect this data. It often requires a lot of time and effort on behalf of a lot of people to bring people into the lab. And as a result of this, we have very little variability on a variety of maybe important dimensions. So imagine we have a study of 100 children, and there's only a small set of children who come from maybe a different background or have different temperaments, as you're alluding to. And we've just fallen short as a field of really measuring these variables and utilizing those variables to understand variation in moral behavior. And so on the whole, I think it's very likely that there are individual differences on all of these moral behaviors, including willingness to engage in punishment or, a willingness to engage in prosocial behavior, but because of the limitations of the samples we've been working with, we just have not been able to adequately answer those questions. So that's something I think we should consider. There's some interesting work, though, I saw presented by a woman named Rachel Leshin at NYU, and she's looking at third-party punishment behavior and how parent political affiliation might impact a willingness to punish an in-group member and out-group member. And I don't remember the exact pattern of results that she finds, so I don't want to incorrectly state them, but in general, it does matter. And that's sort of the key point, which is that the environment that you're growing up in and whatever parent political affiliation is some sort of proxy for is shaping children's behavior at a young age. And so I would love to in the future better understand these sorts of factors that shape the emergence of these behaviors from an individual different standpoint, whether it's sort of, as you're mentioning, these temperament features or some or other sorts of social features like your parent political affiliation or where you're growing up.
So children tend to like inherit, not like literally, but maybe through social learning, their parents' group biases.
It seems like, again, this is, as far as I know, it's unpublished data. And so I don't know the total pattern of it. So I don't want to incorrectly speak about it. But my impression is that this work shows that there is social learning that is occurring, as you're saying, between parent and child that shapes their cooperative behavior. And in many ways, that seems like an uncontroversial thing. Like, of course, like what your parents and your teachers are telling you and what your peers are telling you will shape your willingness to engage in these sorts of behaviors. And it's only just now that I think we're really starting to be able to answer these sorts of questions, in large part because we're able to collect data from more diverse areas in the United States and across the world.
Yeah, that sounds good. So let's close talking about where you see your current and future research directions going. What are some questions you'd like to answer in the next few years?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the big project that I'm currently working on is related to many of the topics we just talked about, which is looking at how children's willingness to punish in these third-party contexts changes depending on the social relationships of the people involved. So in particular, what if the person who does something wrong is in your in-group versus your out-group? So an example that I like to use for this is I'm for better or for worse, an Atlanta Falcons football fan. It's not the best football franchise to stand behind, but our arch nemesis are the New Orleans Saints. And so imagine, I'm driving on a street and I see someone cut me off, and then I notice an Atlanta Falcons bumper sticker on their car. This might temper my anger. I'm like, oh, you're like me. That's cool. But if I see someone cut me off and I see they have a New Orleans Saints bumper sticker, that really changes the context in which I might be willing to punish the transgressor, right? I think we can all feel that if you think about your own sports allegiances. And so in many ways, we're interested in understanding the dynamics that promote behavior of in-groups and promote behavior of out-groups. And if you recall, I mentioned there are different reasons we might engage in punishment. So on one hand, we might punish people because we want them to suffer. We think they deserve pain for having done something wrong. This is this concept called just desserts. Or we might want to punish them because we want to promote norm adherence. We really want people to learn the rules and behave and be a good representation of our group, right? And I think if we take that framework, it seems clear, at least to me, we're hypothesizing that the punishment we direct toward outgroups, so the New Orleans Saint person in this case, I think feels slightly more retributive. So we're less concerned with, promoting norm adherence or teaching the transgressor a lesson in these contexts that involve outgroups. But when it comes to an in-group, it might be more pedagogical, right? I want to sort of promote norm adherence within the in-group. So we're really curious about mapping this, sort of leveraging this motivational framework with this willingness to engage in punishment across different groups. And we're really curious about how that's similar or different in children and adults. So we've designed a bunch of different studies we're hoping to conduct in the next year or so, looking at how children, why they engage in punishment of outgroups compared to in-groups, and also the same with adults. So hopefully I can get a lot of that work done in the next year or so. And it's the project that I'm currently most excited about because I feel it myself. So I want to see whether sort of children act in similar ways. and if we can sort of document this phenomena in children and adults, or whether, maybe I'm just completely wrong.
Yeah,
So
that's
we'll
great.
see.
It seems less obvious to me that children tend to sort themselves into in-group, out-groups. I mean, certainly with adults, we see it. So do you imagine any age patterns where it's like the older you get, the more you start feeling this way?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of developmental work on this question. And actually, maybe contrary to your intuition, children are really apt to sort themselves into groups and really develop what we call in-group love. So at very young ages, they're inclined to give and distribute resources to their in-groups, even when they're extremely arbitrary groups. So if I just said, you are, Adam, a blue person today, you would be more nice to blue people than you would be to a green person. Or if you're in the balloon group versus the kite group, then you'll be kinder to balloon group people than to kite group people. And so this is something children are really naturally sort of doing. There's some interesting work looking at how the younger you are, it's more driven by like an in-group love than an out-group hate per se. And out-group hate kind of comes online maybe later. But either way, I think that children are pretty keen to sort themselves into these groups, and they care about them pretty deeply from a very young age.
Cool. I look forward to seeing what comes out of it, and best of luck with that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your time, Julia.
Appreciate it. It was a wonderful conversation.